So in Minnesota, that's how we pronounced it. Minnesota, and we called soda pop. I think the whole beauty of a decentralized internet is that you're going to find an audience no matter what. And even if that audience is 5 people, that resonated with 5 people. So the reason why I love tackling the climate crisis is because at the end of the day, I am a futurist. I believe in a better future. Most New Yorkers don't know that all of the water, all of the tap water in New York City, which is some of the cleanest and best tap water in the nation. I like to say that everyone has a climate story, and the more familiar we are with our own individual climate story, the better we can serve collectively this movement.
Sophia, we're so excited to have you on the podcast today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian. What's up?
Of course. Sophia, you have such a remarkable background. You are a remarkable journalist, a climate advocate, a public speaker. Let's take us all the way back to growing up in Minnesota, right? What was your childhood like, and how did this kind of shape the person that you are today?
Well, it's awesome being here. So in Minnesota, that's how we pronounced it. Minnesota, and we called soda pop. So there's all this like funny little things about, when you're from Minnesota but I actually only lived in Minnesota for about 5 years. So I was born there in the Twin Cities. My parents were both getting their PhD graduate program at the University of Minnesota. And between the two ages of 2 and 4, I lived in China with my grandparents. Came back to Minnesota. We moved to Memphis, Tennessee. I went to middle school in San Antonio, Texas. And then I went to high school in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I actually grew up between 4 different US states and 2 different countries, including the US and China. And now New York is the longest I've been anywhere. So people are always like, where are you from? And I never know what to say.
That is a very awesome blended childhood, right? Like growing up in Minnesota and going to Memphis and going to Texas. I'm like, it's also interesting too, because the cities that you happen to be in, I don't think the Asian population is that high in these cities.
Yeah, actually, well, you know what? In every one of these cities, we were able to find a Chinese school. So
Okay.
maybe the Asian population wasn't too high, but we always found our people in our community. We always found the local dim sum spot we would go to every Sunday. We always found the, Asian grocery store. So there it all worked out. I'm so grateful for that. Even in Charlottesville, which is like a pretty small town, it had those things.
Yeah, that sounds remarkable. I actually didn't know that, obviously I'm also not very surprised about this as well. I feel like we tend to find our own communities no matter where we are in the world. So that's pretty awesome. So I think in 2013, you graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University with a Bachelor of Arts from the Departments of Fashion Design and Merchandising. And then you got your early start inside Vogue. How did that begin? Can you walk us through that part of your life?
Yeah, it's a bit of a longer story. I studied both fashion and journalism in school. It was media studies. I actually really wanted to get into what is called trend forecasting when I graduated. It was one of the first internships I had in New York City. And trend forecasting is basically, it's back in the day, trend forecasters would put together these incredible forecasts for fashion brands to buy, and they would say what would be a trend in the future so that these brands knew what color palettes to use, what patterns to use, what they should be on the lookout for. And you really fused and looked at all the worlds of arts and culture and even science and what's happening. I just kind of loved that fusion of all these things. And I remember when I had my first internship in trend forecasting in New York, all the trend forecasters, they would be in a different country every other week. They would be in Korea, understanding what's happening on the ground there. And then they would be in Peru, and they would bring back all these different things. And you would just like kind of create these images and videos and fabrics of these incredible trend reports. And I love just fusing all of those cultures and then like making it accessible and understanding how we would use that as a touch point. But basically, all to say is that right when you graduate college, you
Mhm.
can't be a trend forecaster because brands pay insane massive amounts of money, like $100,000 for these reports, and they don't trust people who just graduated. So you need a little bit of a work experience. And because I studied journalism, I was really into I was really into broadcast journalism, storytelling at large. And really, I remember I was like, you know what? If I can't do forecasting, I'm going to do editorial because that also brings together so many different cultures and industries and just subsets of what's happening in the world and then really tries to communicate in it in an accessible and digestible way. And I think like my entire life, I just have loved taking a bunch of different information or a bunch of different trends or a bunch of different whatever it is and then kind of compiling it in my head, and that's how my mind works. I'm like, how do I best now express that and tell the story to the world? Like, how do I take a bunch of micro mini stories and then tie that all together, connect all the dots, and then present it into a new story? So I first started at this digital website as an intern and a contributor called fashionista.com. And then I also worked at a restaurant part-time during that time. So, during from I think it was like 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. I would be at this internship. And then from 6 p.m. until 1 a.m. when the restaurant closed at midnight, but by the time we wrapped up, it was like 1 a.m. I would then take the subway back to this apartment that I shared. The first apartment I ever had in New York, I shared it with, it was like, I just needed a temporary living situation because I didn't know if I was going to be in New York forever. And there was three bunk beds on each wall. So there was like six people in one room. And I found it through a friend who was modeling in New York. And it was a bunch of models just trying to make it in New York. And it was a bunch of, I remember sharing the room with like a bunch of Russians and Eastern European models, and they didn't speak English, and they also didn't eat. And they also had like they would sleep in, and I would wake up early and never see them. But, anyways, so then how it got to Vogue was that I started interviewing at Condé Nast, and I probably had around 20 interviews in total at Condé Nast at many different publications, and a few of them were at Vogue, and then finally landed a freelance position there. And that freelance position turned to a full-time position. That full-time position turned to masthead position. That turned to an editor position, and yeah, so on and so forth.
Definitely learned it. I love the journey. I love the hustle. It kind of reminds me of just like early college days, right? When you just graduated, you don't really know where things are going. And it's funny that your story kind of reminds me a little bit of my past as well. Like when I first graduated college, to save money, I used to stay in people's garages when they have like a mattress in there. That's kind of what
No
I
way.
did. Yeah,
It was like a blow-up mattress in a garage.
sort of. It's I usually charge like $100, $200 per month. For me, it's like, okay, I just have to like make it in LA or make it
Wow.
in SF and do whatever it takes to save money, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I look back on those days and those were like some of the best memories. And I think resiliency is such a muscle. So like the more you practice it, the easier it becomes, right? And yeah, I'm like, I would never do that now. And that's the whole point, right? Is that you don't have to do it in your 30s.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to do that any longer. I think that was like the first 3 years of my early 20s. And then it's like, okay, I got the hang of this. It's time to do more. So
Yeah. Right.
obviously I love looking through your social media. I love everything that you do. Um, kind of kind of trace it back a little bit more, right? What kind of sparked this first interest in you to become more of this outspoken climate advocate, public speaker type of person? Was it always a part of you growing up, or is it something that was recognized by your mentors or surrounding by your parents? How did you become the person that you are today?
I mean, I think probably a whole mix of those things. I think it's both nature and nurture. I think innately I love storytelling. That's actually when I was younger, I would ask everyone so many questions and be so curious about everything and would talk to everyone no matter what age they were. But also I was a really good listener. And I think the biggest part of my journey that I didn't even understand until I was in my mid 20s was that when I lived in China with my grandparents between the ages of 2 and 4, English was my first language, but between the ages of 2 and 4, I forgot all my English because I was only speaking Chinese in China with my grandparents, and they don't speak English. So they weren't speaking English to me, they were only speaking Chinese. And it was very much like the local dialect of this town. So when I came back at 4 years old, I had forgotten all my English. So my parents were like teaching me my ABCs at 4 years old. And I kind of was always behind in school, even up until high school. I didn't start really excelling until I was in college because I just really loved what we were studying. So I think, though, when I was younger, because I was a little bit shy about my English skill sets and learning it and having that learning curve, I became a really, really good listener. And I also just love listening, like active listening and hearing people's stories. So I think that combined with that experience just ended up, like, I think in order to be a good speaker, you have to be a good listener. And my listening skill sets were honed in first before my speaking skill sets. And then slowly, as I got older, and I'm just very passionate about certain topics, I think that came to light. So, yeah.
No, I'm happy to hear that. I mean, definitely our experience are a blend of our past and what we experienced to help us become the person that we are today. And I think that kind of helped you launch your project. So when you left Vogue in 2017, is that correct?
Yeah, I think it was like end of 2017, beginning 2018.
Yeah, and you launched all of the above, right? Can you talk about this project and what like inspired that project?
Sure. So actually, all of the above was launched in 2020. It was during
Oh,
the
okay.
pandemic. And that was a time when, we were all at home. We all had a lot of time on our hands, but then also we had more bandwidth and empathy and compassion to really start to dissect these really broad, large topics that I think as a society we collectively just like kind of shove away. And I was talking about this with a friend last night that the BLM movement wouldn't have happened and wouldn't the BLM movement. I interviewed the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrice, once, and she's always like, people think that a decade ago. It was just during the pandemic where people finally had the stillness and the space to realize how unmoral everything was with our systems. And I think that's also the thing with the climate crisis is that a lot of us are statistically climate delayers. So, like, the majority of Americans aren't climate deniers. They're climate delayers, around 70% of us, because we have jobs to do and food to put on the table and, X, Y, and Z. So, when something is so big and looming, we can't, and it's not part of the 24-hour news cycle, we can't approach it because it's not a priority, even though it is. So we shove it to the side. So all of the above was really just trying to connect all these dots and give people a safe space to ponder and think about these large topics about nature and the climate crisis and how it interrelates to our systems. And yeah, we called it Mother Nature's first talk show because I'm like, everyone has a talk show, but like, why doesn't Mother Nature have one? Like, what would she be saying? So that's kind of how all of the above came to be.
No, I think that's a really important topic to really talk about, especially like understanding sustainability solutions, right? I think you're absolutely right where we're so busy with our lives. We're like, oh, we're gonna worry about that later. But I feel like it's finally has caught up to us, right? There's just so much statistics and stats about how the world, like how the globe is getting more warm. And, even I started noticing too through like perhaps your work and other people's work combined, you start looking or start pushing companies to become more aware of what's happening through their production, right? And I started to notice something too whenever I book my flights, there's a emission statistic now about how much emission these airplanes are emitting going across the world, and then you could select an airline that has less emission, right? So I think the whole idea behind like creating more sustainability solution is definitely starting to happen. But at the time when you started talking about in 2020, what was the global environment like for you to speak up? Were people very receptive of it? How did you get people to like listen to what you had to say? How did you do your own research? Because that's something I think about too, but like I didn't to be honest, I don't know where to start. And I wonder how like you got started with the conversation and getting the momentum that you did and talking about this more seriously.
Yeah, well, I like to say that everyone has a climate story, and the more familiar we are with our own individual climate story, the better we can serve collectively this movement. And that actually has to go back to my upbringing. Again, one side of my family, they're all farmers. Besides my parents and their parents, they come from a long line of farmers. They really understand soil and how much energy it takes to grow a cucumber and just all the energy and resources it takes during that. And then the other side of my family, on my dad's side, they're all primarily Buddhists. and they were Buddhists during the Cultural Revolution and during the Communist Revolution. And they still practice Buddhism. And Buddhism is more of a lifestyle choice. It has the ethos that, you know, we are in harmony, we live in symbiosis and in equilibrium with all living things. So they always just had just a very intentional way of moving through life. We would always have to say gratitude to the meat we were eating, or pray to our ancestors before a big event. Even when I was just in China in January, and we visited the side of my dad's side of the family, and my grandma, not knowing to myself or my sisters, she had spent like 2 weeks before we got there preparing this like big prayer ceremony, because I'm getting married. My little sister's graduating from medical school, and my oldest sister was pregnant. So she was like, I need all the ancestors to help us during this. And she had personally had some commissioned someone to make these prayer altars that you would burn, and one represented the baby, and one represented my love, and the other one represented my little sister's schooling. And we did this whole entire ritual, and the entire family came, and it was a very beautiful thing. And that whole upbringing and ideology, I kind of thought everyone grew up with, oh, we should all be very intentional in how we move through life. I also say, like, if you are first generation or even second generation or even third generation, but if you have immigrant parents or you're around immigrant people in your family, they are like the OG sustainable baddies, I would say. Like, they would, always have that cookie tin that didn't have cookies in it, but had a sewing kit or had something else. We would all use, like plastic bags were always reused like 7 times before we would actually throw it away from the grocery store. There would be no food waste. There's just like food waste is like the number one sin in our household. There's actually this like Chinese phrase, like "li li jie xin ku," that like my mom would tell us all the time, and it's basically about how like every grain of rice counts when you're eating. You have to eat every last grain of rice. So that's like baseline sustainability. Like that is, I don't think we think about it a lot, but that is actually sustainability. Sustainability isn't like buying mason jars and, necessarily being fully plant-based. It's like having this like very holistic understanding with our lifestyle and how we interact with the world. So I think when we first started talking about these issues and then connecting it back to the systems we live in, also during this time, because it was the pandemic, obviously COVID-19 was a huge part of the dialogue. And there's this whole notion at that point where everyone was like, oh, humans are the virus. Like, we're the viruses. We're the ones who created this mess. And because there were like dolphins in the Venice Canal or something. But the truth is actually systems are the viruses. Capitalism, colonialism, Orientalism, when there is hyperconsumerism, those are the systems that have created COVID-19, the climate crisis, etc. Because indigenous communities or communities like my grandparents who were farmers or Buddhists, they have lived in harmony with nature for thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution, before we were in this current climate crisis state.
Wow. I mean, wow, you tied everything so well together. I never really thought about like some of the teachings that my parents taught me too. Like you just mentioned it, right? About being not wasteful of anything, being resourceful, reusing stuff. I was like, yeah, I think a lot of our parents kind of went through the same experience. It's like, yeah, the sewing kit's definitely not the cookie jar, reusing plastic bags. And I feel like even takeout too, like a lot of these takeout items, these one-time use chopsticks, we end up using it for like the whole year, you know?
Exactly. Like I still keep mine, and I don't know why I need to do that, but yes. But I was just thinking, it made me think about when you said that our parents, at least my parents, they taught me everything about sustainability. And I think sometimes the only thing that immigrant parents didn't teach us about sustainability is how to be sustainable with our own energy, because
Mm.
our immigrant parents work so hard and they sacrifice so much and dedicate so much to just, this life and new world that they're creating. And I think the only thing I didn't see in my parents or my friends' parents who are immigrants is sustainability with their own energy and resources. Like, were they being renewable with their own energy? Were they being sustainable with their own time? Were they getting enough rest? Did they have enough balance? Like, did they have inner harmony and symbiosis within themselves? Like that's the one thing that I think they sacrifice probably the most on this journey.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that statement for sure. Like now that you mention it, I don't know if my parents had any harmony. It seems to be working all the time to really make sure that we have a very successful future, right? And a lot of credit to our parents for that. I want to talk a little bit more about your backgrounds and accomplishments, right? Congratulations on all these accolades that you're able to accumulate. As Harvard has recognized you as one of the top climate communicators in 2022, and highlighting your impactful work in raising awareness about climate issues. Refinery 29 as well with Sustainable Innovator Awards. So I mean, obviously you've been doing a lot of great work for everything, especially with climate. How are you able to manage and tie in sustainability with Web3? I'm kind of fascinated by that angle and finding so many articles on that too.
Yeah, I love this conversation because I think it's one we don't have enough. But um, so the reason why I love tackling the climate crisis is because at the end of the day, I am a futurist. I believe in a better future. I also believe in envisioning a future where we operate more efficiently and can optimize that. And I think it's one of the most romantic things we could do is just be a really and like just romanticizing and thinking about how we could build a better future for not just ourselves but just humanity. Like, why else would we be here if we're not creating a better future? And I think a lot of time the doom and gloom, or there's a lot of like post-apocalyptic future scenarios that are playing out. It kind of robs us of that futurism that I think has been innately part of human society for so long. And some of the best artists, creators, creatives, writers, authors, like scientists, like they all have been futurists, right? Like from Einstein to Ai Weiwei, like they're all futurists in their heart. And I think with Web3 in its purest form, it really talks about decentralized system. So um, the blockchain is decentralized, but blockchain is under the umbrella of Web3. And when I think of decentralization, I'm like, the most decentralized system we know is actually nature. There's no hierarchy. There's different levels of ecosystems and keystone species, but everything works in harmony or in tandem together. Everyone has a role, everyone has a purpose, every animal, every plant, even every fungus, and it's all decentralized. And I also even think of what, scientists have coined like the wood wide web, which is how trees and forests communicate to each other through mycelium roots. And they're able to, like, if one tree is getting sick, all the trees in that forest can send extra nutrients to that tree. And they're able to communicate this. And it's incredible that we've been able to discover and study this. And I'm like, that is a decentralized system, like even our own bacterial microbiome system in our own bodies. That's a decentralized system. So when I think of Web3, I think about sustainability because I'm like, we already know and work with and are in contact with all these decentralized systems. So why wouldn't it be possible in this world as well?
I love it. And it looks like you also co-founded Stewart as a way for you to focus on sustainability within the context of Web3. Is Stewart a mobile application or what is Stewart?
Stewart is an NFT, but at the base, we knew that like the whole like profile picture like that was just a passing trend. So we're not like a Bored Ape or a CryptoPunk, but Stewart is a dynamic NFT, and basically the entire utility is to close the climate funding gap. Less than 2% of all global philanthropy goes to climate solutions, and yet it's the biggest crisis that we face today and is the biggest exasperator. So the NFT utility just it funds 8 different nonprofit conservation and indigenous organizations, and it's the artwork itself is based off of the 8 major natural ecosystems of our world, like the temperate forest to the desert to taiga and tundra. And we specifically picked organizations that do work specifically in that ecosystem. So with the blockchain, with donations, normally with charitable donations, you make a one-off donation, and sometimes you can subscribe, but most people don't. You make a one-off donation and you're like, great. the climate crisis is so interconnected and so nuanced, and that if you just donate to the oceans, like it's, or you just donate to, I don't know, food security, it's like there's so many other exasperating factors. So we came up with like this holistic kind of investment portfolio, but it's really just like funding the climate solutions. And yeah, we've been able to donate almost $20,000 now to these climate organizations, and we are all built on a carbon negative blockchain called Cello. It was really just a passion project, and because I was like, okay, again, I'm a futurist and I think this is fascinating. So, and the best way I can learn about this is to build and do it myself. So, myself, one of my best friends, and my older sister, we got together for all Asian, and we were like, let's just do it. And we were all women and women of color. And we would be on these panels with a bunch of crypto bros and these entire auditorium rooms. And we're like, let's talk about nature and let's talk about decentralized systems for the collective. And these were topics and notions that crypto bros at the beginning definitely were not talking about. Even now, not so much.
Yeah, definitely the topics I feel like need to be talked a lot more. And I mean, obviously, thank you so much for raising awareness and raising funding for these nonprofits with environmental changes. I do have a very hot take question. In your opinion, can the climate change problem be avoided? And the reason why I say this is because I feel like so much of our world is driven by capitalistic like principles where it's like money first, profit is more important than sustainability stuff. And we see this across different industries, right? It doesn't matter what industry you're in. I'm gonna pick on the fishing industry, for example. Like there's so much damage to the ecosystem by commercial fishing and all these like nets that destroy ecosystems in the ocean, people leaving all the plastics and stuff in the ocean. In your opinion, can there be a way for us to like continue pushing forward with society, especially with capitalism, and thinking about sustainability at the same time? Is there a solution?
Yeah, there's actually so many solutions. And I
Yeah.
think that's why I call myself a climate optimist, is because we focus on these scenarios where we're like, well, the earth is fucked anyways. Like, why even try? Sorry, pardon my French. But actually the reality is that like it's one, a choice. It's knowing that we have autonomy here. So if you say, well, why even try anyways, you're basically saying that you give up on the world and the home you share. And we just had the solar eclipse this Monday. We were millions of people in America, one of the most divided countries in the world right now, were unified over a global phenomenon that was a natural celestial event. And it's been known to show like sunsets, sunrises are some of the most magical, awe-inspiring things that people say they will ever see in their lives. These are all nature, right? And we ourselves are nature. Um, so yeah, I'm like, this could all be avoided. Like you talk about fishing, and I immediately think of a million solutions that are already happening in the fishing industry. Some of them are so creative and so simple, like these Italian artists to prevent commercial fishing. They basically would get these massive concrete blocks that they would usually carve out into statues, and they would drop it in the ocean floor. And sometimes they would create art or statues around it. But the whole point is that when you're doing like illegal ocean trawling, when you're like scraping the ocean floor, the nets get caught, and it's illegal anyways. The nets get caught in these really massive concrete structures, and then they can't fish anymore. And it's actually like prevented illegal fishing by like 80% already in this area, which is incredible. There's transparency in the marketplace. There's a lot, there's just so much happening. For every kind of like negative thing you see or hear about in the news about what's happening in nature and the climate, there's actually like 10,000 more solutions and people working on that specific problem itself, but you just never hear about it because the news cycle is fed off of like fear, I believe, to some extent. Yeah, so all of these climate solutions exist. Also, it's like it doesn't take much money to reverse the climate crisis. Like I was reading this story about how all these UN scientists were like, oh, it takes about around $380 billion to reverse the climate crisis just to start. 380 billion is like nothing compared to what the US government had already spent on the pandemic. We spent more like than a trillion in COVID relief. So it's not this math problem. It's not a money problem. It's not like this solution problem. It's just really just like this mental problem, whether or not people want to believe that we can do it or not. And I think it's really lazy when people are like, I don't think we can do this. Like, is this avoidable? Like, let's just not deal with this. I'm like, yeah, you're just lazy then, because that means you don't believe in our future.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for being an optimistic person regarding this. I myself, I do fly around, fortunate enough to fly around the world pretty often. And, every time I fly around, I look out the window. I'm like, dude, like, I feel like the Arctic Ocean is melting so quickly. Sea levels are rising. There's a lot of like natural disasters that are caused by the world getting a lot warmer. See a lot more floods, a lot more hurricanes everywhere. To me, that's very it just adds fuel to the fire of like, oh man, like, are we too late? That's something I always ask myself, are we too late? And I read articles about people creating new trade routes across the world, right? And there's something called the Arctic Destroyer. And the whole point of that is to create new trade routes and destroy the Arctic ice. And that's the part of me that feels like, oh man, like is there a solution? But when you talk about there is,
Yeah. Do you want to have kids?
I mean, yeah, eventually I do. Um,
Eventually you do. So I think
yeah.
if you talk to the average person, they would be like, yes, obviously I'm alive on this world and
Mhm.
I either want to have kids or I believe in the next generation and the autonomy in order to have kids. And that in itself is reason enough to fight for what you love. And when you talk about all of those, like the Arctic Ocean, all of that, I actually went to Antarctica in January for a story. And I talked to so many climate scientists about this, like what's happening with the ice caps, what's happening with the ice sheets. And there is some really incredible new research that has come out. And this is like Al Gore's like whole thing right now is that once we stop net additions and what we reach proper net zero, either through carbon capture and lower emissions. Um, Research has shown that the temperatures on Earth will almost stop going up immediately. It's like flipping a switch, and the lag time will be as little as 3 to 5 years. So if we reach net zero as a society through carbon capture technology and through reducing our emissions, then we have like 3 to 5 years where everything will then go back into equilibrium. And that's like how miraculous nature is. It's like Mother Nature right now has like this fever. And it's like, when you get really, really, really sick and you have this fever, and then your fever breaks, and then you're just waiting for your fever break, and you have like that one big sweat session, your fever breaks, and then your body immediately cools down. And it's like, and then you're like, wow, I know I'm through the worst of it. Like, I'm feeling better now. That's literally what Mother Nature and the earth is going through. It's like we're at a fever, and like as soon as that fever breaks, we'll be able to just go back into this equilibrium. And then they like it's just like so incredible because scientists used to think that there would be these feedback, like positive feedback loops, and there will be some things that will still keep happening, like the melting of the ice caps, etc. But we could then pace that in more ways because the temperatures will stop going up. And like that's the switch we need to flip. And so I'm like, that is so attainable. That is so possible. And especially if you want kids and if you believe in the next generation, like that is attainable in just a very few amount of generations to come. That's all I want to say. Sorry.
No, not at all. I like these type of conversations because it always intrigues me, right? And I think what you said about the earth being able to heal itself, that's something that I tend to forget as well. Like I just feel like we just go one direction and it's so to me, maybe I don't know, just naturally kind of pessimistic. I think about like the total buy-in of society and the total buy-in of governments across the world, right? And different policies are going on right now, so much enforcement. Because when you go to like different countries, different parts of the world, you realize that obviously you can feel it in the air whenever you feel like the country does care about the climate change and whatnot. But there's as other countries who are developing, right, that's less a priority. How do you get these buy-ins of these developing countries to be more aware of like the sustainability side? Because when from what I can see, just by doing a quick research, is like air quality is in for example, like Hanoi, Vietnam is one of the worst, and parts of older China, parts of India as well, where you go visit, like the sky is a little bit orange. How do you get them to buy into the whole climate change situation, knowing that the populations tend to be one of the largest on Earth.
Yeah, but the first thing we have to acknowledge if we're going to go into this conversation
Mm-hmm.
is that these developing countries, a lot of them in Asia and the global south, they're going through their own industrial revolution right now. So the global north, Western countries, G20 countries, we went through our industrial revolution 100 years ago, or, and that's actually when the climate crisis started to happen. That was like in the past 100 years and now I think it's a little bit unfair of us to be like, oh, now these global south countries have to mitigate their emissions and not go through their own industrial revolution, when like that's actually what gets you into a developed country. You go from a third world country into a first world country because of your GDP, and that means your output and your economy. But that only happens when you have your own industrial revolution. I'm not saying they like should all pursue it with fossil fuels. Like a lot of them are straying away from coal and fossil fuels. So I think you could go through your own industrial revolution through a renewable energy source and have it be cleaner. But it's also just not fair for anyone in the global north to say like they should limit it, and they should also limit their overpopulation, because we just so happen to be living in countries that have already gone through it, but now we're like at the aftermath of it. So we could experience all of the cushy commodities of living in a post-industrial first world country. But these countries and these populations do not. And I think it's not fair to give them the same kind of limitations, because these global north countries didn't have those limitations. So I think it becomes a very nuanced conversation from that extent.
Yeah, I mean, you do bring up a lot of good points as well. So I do agree with most things you have to say. I'm learning a lot from this podcast, right? Because I really rarely have a guest that talks about climate change and sustainability, and I'm taking this opportunity to like really pick your brain and really like get different perspectives, because there's obviously a lot more that I want to learn, and I want the listeners to learn about this. So as we are tying back to like the listener part, right? How have you leveraged like social media to really get your message out there? And what kind of experience have you had like building community around this, especially on platforms like Meta, Instagram, Facebook, and so on? Just kind of walk me through that process, right? Of like just putting out the right message, the right graphics, the right videos, the right proper interviews. How have you gone about building your community?
To be honest, I don't go about social media to gain followers or to gain likes even. I just feel like sometimes there's a truth that has not been said and it needs to be said. And I would like to add to the conversation, and I just put it out there. I don't think there's, when you're like, how do you use the right graphics or the right video or the right quote? And it's like, that's the whole point. There's no right anything. Like, I think the whole beauty of a decentralized internet is that you're going to find an audience no matter what. And even if that audience is 5 people, that resonated with 5 people. Like, I oftentimes think that we can obviously live in these algorithm echo chambers. And it's just, I think my community is, I'm really grateful for them. And it's been incredible to see what has been able to happen and shift. And a lot of the community came during the Stop Asian Hate movement, because no one was talking about how all of those attacks on Asians, like we were talking about how usually the
Perpetrator. Mm-hmm.
perpetrator, I'm like, why does that sound that way? The perpetrator was a person of color. And the first thing that news outlets would do would be like identify like this Black man, blah, 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 at this thing, attack this older Asian person. And they were pitting communities of color against each other. And I get it. Yes, we want, like it was really infuriating and everyone wanted justice. But I'm like, this is a byproduct of white supremacy. And no one was talking about that. I'm like, pitting against us against each other is exactly what white supremacy does. Continuing following this cycle and pattern of behavior as a collective isn't going to help either movement. This was like, right at the tail of the BLM movement. This was at the beginning of the Stop Asian Hate movement. No one was talking about this stuff. So I just thought that that truth needed to be there. And it was just like very clear to me that us fighting any other communities of color was actually only bringing us down and upholding white supremacy. And for us and white people to actually get comfortable with that word, because just because you're white doesn't mean you believe or tie into white supremacy. It's just the reality of the systems we live in, like I mentioned, and the reality of what we end up being byproducts to based off of our society. And America has a very long, controversial, nuanced history that has been ignored. And yeah, so the community is just a beautiful, beautiful byproduct, I think, of speaking the truth. And I'm very grateful for that. And I always want to be checked like by my community if it's like, you know, yeah, I want to be held accountable. I want to stay humble and be checked by them. It's not like I'm not trying to be like I'm talking down to you guys or I'm talking to you guys. I'm trying to have this like very open conversation because these aren't conversations that happen in the mainstream media, and that's why it happens on social.
Yeah, I do appreciate being so frank about your community and letting your community like check and fact check you and be aware to and be open to that too. That's very, I think that's very mature and very open-minded of you to even consider that. And the last thing I really want to talk about on this podcast is your podcast, right? I know you host a podcast called Climate Talks on that talks about climate related matters. Like, tell us more about this podcast. What was the objective behind it? What do you hope to get out of it? And how do you even what kind of guests do you and topics do you bring onto the show?
Yeah, so this was a podcast I did with Meta, and that was their first foray into climate. It debuted at COP26. So that was, and that our first season, we covered climate misinformation, we
Wow.
covered climate advocacy versus activism, we covered watersheds and protecting natural resources. We covered so many different intersectional topics and kind of just try to make it as accessible and digestible and tangible to an individual person. And I always say, yes, we're all individuals, but it's individual collective action that shifts systems and actually brings about radical change. So, there was even things like we talked about do you know where your water comes from in Las Vegas? Like when you use tap water, do you know where it comes from?
Uh, for the most part, I think I know from that reservoir nearby of Hoover Dam, I believe. And then I was looking at statistics of that too. Like majority of it goes to like California. It's like state negotiations about partitions per state. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I try to do a little bit of research of where things come from.
Yeah, I think even just starting there, that's a lot what one of the where the podcast talked about is like starting from knowing that we have finite resources, knowing where it comes from so we understand it's not just a God-given right, um, even though it is our baseline. But even like in New York City, most New Yorkers don't know that all of the tap water in New York City, which is some of the cleanest and best tap water in the nation, but it's because it comes from this watershed in the Catskills that
Wow.
was built decades ago. But people, even in the Catskills, like people in upstate, like if you're in Poughkeepsie, your water comes from the Hudson River.
Mm.
So, and if our watershed, if it ever ran out or something happened to it, then New York City's entire second source of water stream would come from the Hudson River, which the Hudson River is pretty gross sometimes. And I think if people knew this, they would just be a little bit more conscientious with like when their water is happening. And it's just like we want to know where our food comes from, right? Sometimes, and we want to know where all these other things comes from. It's like we need to know where our energy and our resources comes from. So that's kind of what the podcast was helping to do is like make it more accessible and tangible for your own lifestyle wherever you are.
Yeah, I love it. And I guess the final question I have for you, Sophia, is what's next for you? Right? I know you're doing all these great work, you got so much recognition. You're putting out so much good content out there. What's next for what you want to do in your career and how you want to take this conversation around climate change and sustainability?
I think what's next for me is not just connecting the dots from science to systems, but it's also connecting the dots from science to systems to spirituality, which might sound a little woo woo, but I really think that the climate crisis is a spiritual and an emotional crisis. It's a crisis of connection because the science has existed for past 3 decades and we're still really just fighting against it. And I think it's really because these systems as well, like hypercapitalism, they really break down how we connect towards each other. Even just, you know, borrowing eggs from your neighbors now, that doesn't happen as much anymore because we live in these silos and we think we need to do everything ourselves. Or, when we used to live in communes or we used to live in villages, like everything would be a shareable economy. And I think a lot, we're just, we're byproducts over these systems. So I just what's next is helping us all understand that it's all interconnected, and why this is a spiritual crisis, and how to get more in touch with that. And then also just having people realize that the climate crisis is when there's problems as massive as this is, we're going to come up with massive solutions. And it's really just leading us into a new era of behavior and lifestyle and living as a society. And that happens all the time. If you look, anthropologists calls this next wave the planetary era. And so far, we've been living in the empire era. The empire era is very linear and hierarchical, masculine energies focused. The planetary era is very circular, collective focused, feminine energy focused. And I think a lot of us already live in that way from a mindset perspective, but our society doesn't live that way. And I think it's really just having people be moved and excited to move into this next era and embrace this change and view the climate crisis as an opportunity to shift humanity for the better.
Well, I'm ready. I'm excited, and I'm ready to like really support what you're doing and really definitely bring more awareness to the global climate change. Sophia, thank you so much for all your insights and great knowledge that you're sharing in the podcast. Like it's honestly, this is pretty unique for me. And I love the unique perspective that you bring to the table. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me.
Of course. Of course. Thank you.